general agreement on tariffs. And that agreement served as a basis for most of the trade negotiations and round of negotiation until we got to the Uruguay round, where countries then agreed to a larger amount of disciplines and also to the establishment of this new organization. Also, as a historical background, I just want to highlight here for you guys the memberships of the WTO concerning Asia countries. So you see that right at the foundation of the World Trade Organization, we had a lot of Asian countries, and throughout the years, more of them have joined the organization. The one most recently, Kazakhstan. So the World Trade Organization has 164 members. That accounts for over 98% of the world trade. It has, nevertheless, a small secretariat, 623. The building is located in Geneva. The daily operation is carried out by the Director General, Dr. Yonge Okonjo-Iweala. She's the first female and the first African national to be a head of this organization. She joined just over a year ago. Nevertheless, the Ministerial Conference is the highest decision-making body, and that Ministerial Conference takes place every 2 years. Interesting, I just wanted to show you that the very first Ministerial Conference was held in 1996 in Singapore. So now going through the second part about the structure and the function of the WTO. The main function of this organization is to allow trade to go as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. To accomplish these goals, the WTO carries out different tasks, being some of them the administration of trade agreements. There are over 20 texts with very specific disciplines for the trade of goods, for sanitary measure, for technical regulation, for subsidies. There's one rule book for different sets of types of measures. We also have a dispute settlement to make sure that countries have a space to come and discuss whether they feel their rights have been violated by their trade partner. So it doesn't escalate to war. It is resolved within this organized rule-based system of dispute settlement. Lastly, the organization also provides a continued forum for countries to come together and negotiate further rules, being the latest one, the agreement on fishery subsidies that was signed in July earlier this year. So now I would like to bring to your attention two important cases that concerns the protection of sea turtles and baby seals, which became a trade dispute. So the very first one, as some of you might know, one of the causes for a vastly decrease on the population of sea turtles is the fact that some of them are incidentally killed when shrimps are caught and the sea turtles are entangled on the nets. To prevent that from happening, some scientists design a device that it's called turtle excluder device, which enable the shrimp to be caught, but the sea turtle to escape from the net and then have higher percentage of survival. Knowing that, one country decided to protect the sea turtles in their waters and the neighboring waters and make this requirement mandatory that all shrimps should be caught using this device. However, as we know, sea turtles are migratory species, and hence one of the local NGOs of this country decided to ask that these requirements to be mandatory for all shrimps, domestic shrimp and imported shrimps. And the court granted that, and the bill was then expanded to other this extraterritorial effect. As you might think, other countries did not like this, and they thought it was an external interference and a violation of the WTO rules. So let's look a little bit what the WTO trade law says. And as I said before, there is over 20 texts, and I will here just give you a very, 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 very short overview of one of two, actually, main principles of the WTO law that come across all of its texts. One is that when countries are trading with each other, there should be no discriminatory treatment when we are dealing with the same type of product. Secondly, there should be no unnecessary obstacles. That includes import and exports ban and other non-tariff requirements like technical regulations, like the one to exclude the caught of sea turtles. However, the WTO also says that a country can enact some measures when there is a necessity to protect its public morals, when there is a necessity to protect human, animal, plant life, or health. It also says that measures relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resource are also legitimate concerns to base a trade measure. Also, let me just highlight to you how the dispute settlement works. So you have first, when one country feels it has been violated, it asks for consultation where you have some mediated conversation between these countries. And then if that doesn't succeed, you have a panel of experts that will evaluate will assess what is the facts and also what are the law applicable to the situation. And there is also a second phase, if needed, where a country can appeal if it feels that the outcome of the panel was not addressing its concerns, and the appellate body will look at the applicable law. The whole analysis goes through several steps, but what I would like to highlight is that one, upfront, it's difficult to know which discipline, which set of discipline will be applicable. So it's very important to always identify what's the purpose of the measure. Secondly, it is also important to understand that there is a difference between the purpose of the measures that defines which sets of law will be applicable, but also it's very important to understand and take into account the design of the measure, how it is applied, so the manner it is applied, as this also can lead to some findings of inconsistencies. So going back to that case, as I alluded before, trade partners did not like. So right at the beginning of the WTO, in 1997, a formal dispute settlement started to evaluate the legality of that requirement of only allow the domestic and imported shrimp products to be sold if they had used that device. So panel and the appellate body concluded that the measure was inconsistent with the WTO law. And you can imagine how frustrated that was for all the efforts put in by the NGOs to protect the sea turtles. And then you have this third body say, well, that is inconsistent. That has gathered a lot of protests on the street, and still a lot of people mention this case as being a very detrimental to our efforts to protect animals. However, many people miss a very important reasoning from this case when we get only to this conclusion and say, well, it was inconsistent, we need to drop. No, it was no need to drop the whole measure. So let me go and explain. The the case was the appellate body in the panel found that the objective of the measure to protect the sea turtles was legitimate. This is a huge victory on our end to make sure that the WTO sees the protection of sea turtles as legitimate objective. However, the manner in which that objective was accomplished, was trying to be accomplished, constitute an unjustified discrimination. And looking at the case, we can see that some elements that came as being a justified discrimination regards, for instance, the fact that for some countries, it was given 3-4 years for them to adjust their production methods to incorporate that new device. Whether for other countries, they only had 3 to 4 months. So that imbalance was understood as being a discrimination. Also, there was some lack of flexibility on the type of device. There was only one type of device that was allowed, and equivalence was not being granted for other measures that could achieve the same outcome. And the third element that led to the conclusion that was a discriminatory treatment among countries was that for some countries, it was extended efforts to come to an agreement and find common sense, whether for other countries, there was a lack of conversation among trade partners. So once again, we will go back to the objective and the manner in another case that was also a milestone to understand how trade rules and animal protection efforts interact. So some of you might know and might feel that the hunting of seals for the manufacture of clothes, of omega-3 medication, and I don't know, any other devices, it's inhumane practice. So one country or one group of countries have decided that we don't want to be part of this practice. Therefore, they establish a legislation saying we prohibit the market and importation of all seal products that comes from these inhumane practices, except under 3 conditions. They said, well, if the hunted is made by indigenous community, that's okay. If the hunted also come from marine resource management, that's okay to enter our market. And if it's occasional products brought by travelers, that's also okay. Well, other countries also thought that this legislation was unjustified discrimination, and once again claimed there was a violation of WTO rules. So in 2009, another very important WTO formal dispute settlement began. The panel and the appellate body, once again, concluded that the measure was inconsistent with the WTO law. Do we need to throw out all the measure? No, because once again, the objective of the measure to protect the public concerns regarding animal well-being was upheld by the WTO. They agreed that it's a legitimate objective and the right of a country to impose such trade barriers. However, the manner in which was applied was thought to be arbitrary in some aspects. Most specifically, the fact that there was a discrimination between the regulatory treatment of indigenous hunt and the commercial hunt. So in that particular case, just like the previous case, what the country needed to do to take its measure in compliance with the WTO law was simply to change a little bit the manner in which was applied and not necessary to revoke the measure. So what are the lessons that we can draw from these 2 cases? One is that animal welfare measures are not per se incompatible with trade law. This is very important as there is a lot of misconception. Secondly, that attention must be paid to the manner in which the measure is designed and implemented. And in regard to the manner in which it's being, some recommendations very briefly. At an early stage, a country should communicate its intention to implement trade measures. There is a notification requirement. So it's very important that when we are advocating and we are having discussion at the parliament, that there is a formal notification to trade partners, the intention of adopt a legislation. In that way, unintended discriminatory measure can be resolved at early stage. Also, try to see all the other possible measures that you can use to achieve that desired outcome. This is important because the WTO will always try to see what is the least restrictive measure. Finally, take into consideration the option of adopting international standards. Tomorrow, you will be talking about the World Organization for Animal Health Standards, the OA, or formerly OIE standards. This is also very important to take into consideration as it grants the countries adopting the international standard presumption of compliance. And by no means I want to say that that needs to be the ceiling of if a country desires to go above, it can go above the international standards, but it needs to take into consideration what are the justification to go above. So that would be my recommendation for advocating for animal welfare within the boundaries of the multilateral trade system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maciel. That's a great talk. Now let's move to our next speaker, Mr. Daniel Pérez Vega. He represents trade and animal welfare leader of Eurogroup for Animals. Now, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Many thanks. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and able to explain a little bit how EU trade policy works, how they treat animals, what are the consequences, and what are we looking forward for the future. So if you allow me, I'm going to show my presentation, and let me see if I can do that. Perfect. I hope you all see my presentation there.
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
Perfect. So you will see that many of the points I will raise are actually a bit compatible with or complementary to what Carolina just mentioned, because the first thing we need to see, and I'm going to show here, is why the EU has trade agreements, why we need to go beyond the WTO. We want to trade with some partners. And then I will see how animal welfare is implemented, when it's implemented in trade agreements, what are the future agreements that we're going to have, how we're going to look at the future, and hopefully to see if there are some changes. So the first thing I want to mention is that the EU has a vast network of FTAs. There are about 41, I think, that are in force, so that are being implementing right now with about 70 partners, and there are way more in negotiation. The EU has negotiated, currently negotiating with many Asian countries, going to start negotiating with Indonesia, with Thailand, is negotiating with Australia, but also in Latin America, with Mercosur, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, with African countries. So there's a huge vast of FTAs, a vast network of FTAs. And why do we have that? Why does the EU need to have that? First, as Carolina was saying, is because at the WTO, there's a principle, a non-discrimination principle. So you cannot treat one product better than another, except if you have an FTA. If you have an FTA, a free trade agreement, that means that partners are going to agree on certain rules. They're going to reduce the duties. So they're going to reduce all the tariffs on agricultural products. You will see that they're usually high. So we're going to reduce those duties, and we're going to agree on certain rules, on technical rules, on the labeling, on the health issues. So partners can trade better. Well, but not better, but more. Concerning the EU, I think it's very important to keep in mind that with this huge, vast network of FTAs, the EU is currently the first exporter of agricultural products, and the third importer of agricultural products. So let me show you now what a typical EU trade agreement looks like. You have the biggest, I would say, the biggest and the most important chapter, which is the market access. In this market access, we have a schedule. So we're going to agree on all the tariff lines, all the products that we have, goes from industrial products, cars, medicines, machines, computers, services now, but also agricultural products. And in those schedules, we're going to agree with partners. We're going to say, like, we're going to reduce the duties. Because agriculture is a sensitive product, we're usually going to agree that with a certain timeline, we're going to reduce the duties. So in year 1, we're going to reduce 5%, and in year 2, another 5%. And we go like that until arriving to 0%. For some products, for example, in beef products, poultry products, we're going to agree with a quota. So we're going to say what we call a TRQ, a tariff rate quota, where within this quota, we're going to reduce the duties, could go up to 0 with a certain time. So it's a gradual liberalization. And any other quantity that goes beyond that quota will pay the full tariff. I mean, this is still, it seems like a small quota, but usually it's really big. For example, with Mercosur, that is with Brazil, that is one of the biggest beef producers. In the agreement that the EU has negotiated, that is not implemented yet, the EU agreed to import from Brazil almost 100,000 tons of beef, which is massive. So you have first this market access chapter. Then you also have all the SPS, so the sanitary and phytosanitary issues, and the TBT, all the labeling technical requirements. In those chapters, most of the time, the rules we have concerns the end product. So we're not going to look how the product was made. We're looking what is the requirements for the end product. So basically, we're going to look the animal product you're importing. Is it safe to consume? How much contaminants it has? How much pesticides? When you look at the labeling, what kind of labeling are we going to have? What kind of labeling can we have? Can we put, for example, the origin? All those kind of measures are going to be on the end product, but we don't look at the production methods. Then you have another chapter, which is more cooperations on many issues. You have cooperations, for example, on gender. You can have cooperations on sustainable development, but also on animal welfare. You will see that I will come this to later, but the problem with these cooperations most of the time is that it's very just non-committal language. Parties will agree to discuss. We're going to set a forum. We can meet once a year and maybe discuss of animal welfare, maybe not. So that's a huge issue. I'm going to come back a bit later on that. And then you have another chapter, which is very important for NGOs and for us, is the trade and sustainable development chapters. In these chapters, we're going to look at many issues of trade and the trade has on sustainable development. We look, for example, into human rights, labor rights, and now we also look into animal welfare. So again, the problem with this trade and sustainable development chapters that are very important is that most of the time they don't make it for the market access, because trade and sustainable development chapters are binding, they're part of the agreement, but there's no way to enforce them. There's a huge problem with those chapters. So my conclusion in this very fast presentation of European free trade agreements is that we do not look at production methods. We're completely blind to production methods. We give huge market access through gradual liberalization, reduction of duties, or TRQs to certain partners, but we don't look how they were made. We don't really care how the animals were. They could be, for example, I don't know, battery cages maybe. In the EU is forbidden, but don't really look into that. We're not gonna look if the product, if it's a beef product, had consequences on deforestation, on biodiversity loss. Now we don't look that much whether there were some feed loss or not. So that's a huge problem we have with FTAs. And I'm gonna give you some examples of some of the FTAs that are now in force. First thing I must say, the first animal welfare provision was included for the first time already 20 years ago, but that's still only because we have trade agreements far before that, and it was with Chile. The problem is that since then, FTAs have an animal welfare provision, a cooperation, as I said earlier, but there's a weak implementation because the wording is not strong enough. Parties only meet and they might discuss about an issue. The EU can bring forward, for example, a recommendation, but you need two to tango. You need two to agree to cooperate. If the other partner does say, like, I'm not interested in this topic, then we cannot do anything. And there is, of course, a lack of resources. That's not a priority. Animal welfare in the implementation of FTAs has for now not been a high priority for the EU. So for example, let's look at the agreement with Canada. Since the agreement is in force, 5 years, that was in this September, the market access chapter is implemented. And as a consequence, we have a huge increase of beef imports from Canada. But on the animal welfare part, there is some exchange of information. The EU and Canada can meet once a year or twice a year to discuss, but there is no operational objectives. The EU, for example, has brought forward to Canada some issues about animal transport, about horse welfare, but for Canada, it's not a priority. So there's no obligation to discuss. Nothing has happened so far. With Vietnam, the agreement with Vietnam, since it's in force, there has been an increase in poultry and fish imports from Vietnam. And on animal welfare, we only have one article about animal welfare. It's a standalone article that has some potential because it says that parties can cooperate for technical improvements. The problem is that it has not been used yet. With Japan, same. Since the agreement is in force, there is an increase in dairy, beef, and pork imports from Japan, even if they remain low because Japan is not a huge source of supply for the EU. And we have since then been exporting live horses for slaughter. The problem there, again, is that there are possibilities of cooperation, but it has not been used yet. So as a consequence, what do we have? We have trade agreements that are being implemented. We do not look how products are made. We do not look at methods of production, but we import and we trade more animal products. So the consequence that we take is that unconditional trade, because we don't look at the conditions in animal product, fosters intensive animal farming. This has brought a lot of discussions in the EU, particularly the agreement with Mercosur. So Mercosur, it's Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And it has brought a lot of discussions in the public eye in Europe because of all the consequences with the Amazon rainforest. We see every year, every summer, there are many fires. So this is something that has brought the attention of policymakers here, because the public is a bit hesitant. It has become a bit of a toxic agreement. People don't really want the EU-Mercosur agreement, mainly for environmental reasons. So the EU has brought up for now about 3 or 4 years some kind of new strategy, the Green Deal, that aims to have a lot of environmental sustainability policies, and the Farm to Fork strategy. The Farm to Fork strategy, it is the farm policy of the Green Deal. So how do we make farm policy better, greener, more sustainable? In that Farm to Fork strategy, there is one line that has a lot of potential because it calls on EU trade policy to seek not only for cooperations, because we thought cooperations are good if implemented, but they're not, but also to obtain ambitious commitments from partners in areas such as animal welfare and antimicrobial resistance. And also has a call to include sustainable food system chapters in free trade agreements. So how has that been translated so far? So far, we have some agreements in negotiation with Chile, with New Zealand, for example, where there is now a sustainable food system chapter that includes animal welfare. The agreement with the UK, it's a very particular agreement because, as you know, the UK was a member of the EU. And since they left, we negotiated a free trade agreement, which is by far the most ambitious agreement the EU has. In that agreement, it's a bit of an exception. The Sustainable Food Systems chapter makes a clear link between animal welfare and sustainable food production. And now there are 2 agreements that are negotiated that are not in force yet. So the negotiations just ended a few months ago, and those are with New Zealand and Mercosur. Those agreements, even if they have a lot of issues, because again, as mentioned, in Mercosur is a huge agricultural power, and they produce in a very sustainable manner. There is for the first time ever in that agreement, there was a conditional liberalization. By that, I mean that for egg products that will be exported to the EU, we have to comply with EU standards on animal welfare. The trade in egg products is very small from Mercosur, so the impact would be relatively small, but it has a lot of potential if we actually expand that approach to many other products. And that's what more or less happened with New Zealand, because with New Zealand, the agreement was concluded only this summer, and we have a conditional liberalization for beef products. That means that beef products aiming to be exported to the EU could only be grass-fed, so explicitly excluding feedlots. What does that mean? I mean, does that mean that all trade agreements will have conditional liberalization? We're not sure about that. We're looking now into the agreements with Australia, with India, with Indonesia. Those are big countries, big partners for the EU that we're negotiating. We don't really know what's going to happen with those agreements. We don't know if the new policy of the EU, the farm to fork, and how much ambition and cooperation and ambition commitments from partners we're going to have. What is going to happen with the Mercosur Free Trade Agreement? It's a very controversial agreement. It has become toxic. Will the EU actually manage to ratify that agreement? We don't really know what's going to happen. So perhaps just to finish on this, maybe just food for thought here. If it's so difficult to negotiate with partners ambitious commitments on animal welfare, maybe one way to address animal welfare in trade would be with autonomous measures. Autonomous measures are legislation that a partner can adopt and say, like, from now on, any animal product we trade in will have to comply with these standards regardless of the origin. It will be challenging because, as Karina was saying, we have to be WTO compliant, and we have to prove that it actually protects public morals. There's no discrimination, that does not distort trade. But for example, for the EU now, we have one animal welfare standard that applies to all imports regardless of the origin, and that's the time the slaughter. All animal products that are imported to the EU that were slaughtered in their countries have to comply with animal welfare standards, EU animal welfare standards. So maybe that's something for the future, something that we could look into that, some way to condition trade, some way that we're going to foster, instead of fostering unsustainable methods of production, that we can foster more sustainable methods of production where animal welfare is actually taken into account. I'm looking forward to you have any questions on this, and many thanks for the opportunity speaking to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Great to talk a lot of information. I'm sure people having questions can please enter your questions in the Q&A box. Now we have our final presentation, which will be a video, the presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Clive Phillips. He's a visiting professor at the Estonia University of Life Science and an adjunct professor at the Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute in Australia. And he's going to talk about the trade in farm animals and animal welfare in Asia.
Thank you, Peter, and I will be sharing his recorded video now.
In Asia. Hello, everybody. My name is Clive Phillips, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about trade in farm animals and animal welfare in Asia. This is an outline of what I'm going to talk to you about. First of all, I'm going to consider the growth in meat output worldwide and the concerns that it brings, animal welfare issues, pollution issues, disease transmission, genetic diversity of livestock, and winding up by considering the overall suffering of animals. So first of all, if we consider trade in livestock, this has been growing worldwide over the last 10 to 20 years. And major exporting nations have been emerging: Australia, Brazil, and several parts of Europe. From Australia's perspective, the live export of sheep and cattle are our biggest concerns. Sheep to the Middle East largely feeding the religious festivals such as Eid al-Adha, and cattle going to Asian countries, particularly Japan, China, Korea, Pakistan, but also some to the Middle East. Consumption levels are rising, and there is support in many of those countries for their own dairy industry to develop. Hence, Australia exports heifers to become part of the dairy industry. We also have some export of goats to Malaysia and occasional export of camels to the Middle East. Now, worldwide, meat production by livestock has been increasing. This has been almost exponential if we chart that from the 1960s, as we can see here. Particularly the production of poultry and to a lesser extent pig meat has been increasing. The major areas where that production is coming from are the Americas and Asia, with China being the biggest producer of nearly all the meat types. But Australia is also a significant livestock producer and producing cattle and sheep in particular and sending those through to Asia. That trade has been increasing and increasingly of live animals. The reason for the increase in trade is partly because population growth. This is the world population, currently standing at 7.5 billion people and scheduled to increase to 11 billion people by the end of the century. Population growth rate is now declining, but the population is still increasing. But not only that, people's affluence has increased, which gives them greater ability and a more desirable eating pattern of eating meat in many of the developing countries. However, it brings problems of food security. If we look at the efficiency of land use in terms of producing digestible energy that can be digested by humans from livestock compared with crops, it's only about 20% as efficient to get the food from livestock compared with crops, slightly more for dairy than the next most efficient animal, and that is poultry, chicken. With protein, it's not quite such a bleak picture. Around 50% as efficient to produce the food from livestock compared with crops, but there's still a great deal of wastage. And the problems really came to be realized back in approximately a decade ago when the FAO published a report which said that by 2050, if we want to sustain the same level of meat production, we're going to have to double it compared to what it was at the beginning of the century. And the same with milk. So doubling the production, and then land prices started going up. People realized that food security is in jeopardy. And countries started to want to become major meat exporters. In Kazakhstan, for example, President Nazarbayev said we have to become the country that exports meat. For this purpose, we have all the conditions and there's plenty of pasture. That could equally well have been China or Uzbekistan. Now, that growth in meat production is mainly occurring in the developing world and mainly in the poultry and to a lesser extent, the pig sector. The growth in demand is primarily in the Asia region and to a certain extent in Latin America. In the past, we've had a lot of constraints on trade in meat and the live animal, but that has been alleviated to a certain extent and brokered by the World Trade Organization by organizing trade agreements. European partner agreements with Africa and the Caribbean countries, the European Union with Brazil, Chile, Switzerland, Canada, the US, and then the bilateral agreements between China and Australia to reduce tariffs. But as well as free trade agreements, problems have started arising. There have been trade wars and sanctions imposed. There were sanctions imposed on Australian beef exports by Indonesia following the debacle in 2011, when cruel treatment of the cattle at slaughter plants was made public. There have been cod wars for several decades between the UK and Iceland, Japanese whaling issues, and of course in Russia the issue of trade wars has been in the foremost of everyone's minds, and perhaps most evidenced by the opening and closing on a regular basis of McDonald's, which Russia sees as a symptom of Western retailing. Some of the problems that arise are because of cultural differences, and religious differences between, for example, Australia, a predominantly Christian country, and Indonesia, its nearest neighbor, a Muslim country. But China, atheistic and with Buddhist traditions, India, Hindu religion, and the Arabic tradition in the Middle East, major religious differences and cultural differences as well. A study we did about 15 years ago identified some very diverse attitudes to animals in Asian countries. So, for example, when we created an index for reverence for animals, people believing in animals' rights, essentially, then the Chinese performed quite favorably on that compared with Korea, and to an even greater extent with Iran. And similarly, when we created an index based on a questionnaire for the spiritual power of animals, again, China had, the Chinese population had strong beliefs in that respect. But if we look at animal suffering, then of all the countries in Asia that we monitored, and indeed those in Europe as well, the Chinese had much less concern for animal suffering than did those respondents in Iran and Korea. And in relation to animals and nature, we often think, well, the Chinese do have a lot of reverence for the panda, the giant panda, for example. Compared with people in Iran, yes, they do have more reverence for animals' position in nature. One of the other problems that we see with this growth of considerable growth of meat production is the pollution. Now, this is not a conference about pollution, but I will just mention that the pollution problems pervade all the environments that animals can possibly impact on: the aerial environment, the ground environment, and the water environment. The aerial environment primarily by their production of methane and the production of carbon dioxide from fertilizer plants, contamination of land and water as well, with toxic residues. What we see in moving animals around the world, as we are doing at the moment, is a transmission of nutrients. And this shows how nutrients from pork, particularly in the form of nitrogen, moves to other parts of the world in association with the exported animals. The potential for pollution isn't necessarily improved if the animals are produced close to where they are, where the products are utilized. New Zealand, for example, can actually be more efficient in terms of whether the animals have global warming potential or an output of phosphorus or sulfur, or indeed in efficiency of energy use, because they rely primarily on grazing systems. whereas dairy systems in Sweden and Holland are less efficient because they're much more intensive and relying more on housed cows. So the milk from New Zealand has to travel a lot further. This is for milk consumed in Europe, and the milk from Sweden and Holland doesn't travel nearly as far, but actually has greater pollution potential. Another problematic area surrounding the live transport of animals around Asia in particular is the spread of disease. Foot and mouth disease spreads westwards and eastwards from the Indian subcontinent. Influenzas spread from China, where they start it with that close proximity between humans and chickens. Whereas with foot and mouth disease, obviously, it's the close proximity between cattle and people in the Indian subcontinent. In Africa, we have a similar picture for ticks and tick-borne fever. One of the major concerns about the way our livestock production systems are developing is the contraction of biodiversity, the concentration of genetic resources, so that it fits the pattern of how we want animals to produce now, but it may very well not fit that pattern of how they should produce in the future. So just 6,000 great-grandparents are responsible for the birds that produce 75%, 800 billion eggs per year, and 15,000 meat chickens similarly. The chicken nowadays represents 10 to 20% of the total world bird population. So we have narrowed our genetic resources, we've expanded the role of the chicken and diminished that of wild birds, which are not productive and therefore are under threat. We've bred a bird that will grow to 2 kilograms slaughter weight in faster and faster time, now 30 to 35 days. In 1963, it was 70 days that it took to reach that weight. Not only that, we have concentrated the species down to a small number. If we compare the number of animals exported and how that's grown over the last 50 years or so, we've seen a big increase in the number of chickens and of pigs, a lesser increase in sheep, cattle, and goats, and no increase in the animals that are less commonly consumed, horses, buffalo, camels, etc. So we're concentrating our meat production to a small number of species led by the chicken and to a lesser extent the pig. That leads me to suggest that in today's world, whereas we might believe that the advocacy groups are helping to improve animal welfare, and I'm sure that is the case, and that animal welfare is standing at a better level than it ever has done in the past. In fact, I think that's far from the case. I think nowadays we see increased numbers of animals suffering and a greater scale of suffering. Why do I think that? Firstly, because world meat production and milk consumption has been increasing. There are many more animals. The biomass of cattle on this planet is many times that of the biomass of humans. There is more reliance on small animals such as chickens, so there are many, many more of them. If we were relying on large animals such as cattle, then it would be less of an increase. And each animal has a right to life and is sentient in its own right. And so we have to give credit to that. There are many more animals dependent on us for a good quality life. And they don't get it in many of the intensive production systems, especially for poultry and for cattle, where the basic needs of the animals are quite clearly not being allowed for. As well as increasing number of animals, we also see a dramatic increase in the live trade of animals, causing those potential risks of diseases, many zoonotic diseases as well, as we've seen in recent years with the growth of the pandemic. And we see an increased animal production in developing countries, whereas they don't necessarily have always the most intensive production systems. They don't usually have strong animal welfare standards. So to conclude, I think careful consideration is required in meeting the food needs of the increasing world population. We have to look at the welfare of the animals that are increasingly being used for producing meat and milk products. We have to look at the other risks and consider whether consuming alternatives such as plant-based products, cell-based meats may meet our food security needs better. Because as it currently stands, the growing animal trade will, I think, jeopardize world food security, and the impact of that will be on the poorer sectors of society. And it is therefore important to consider all ethical aspects: the welfare of the animals, the use of the animals, their environmental impact, the disease impact potentially, and how we can have the most efficient form of food production. If we can find alternatives to the intensive livestock production that we're developing, it will release resources, energy resources and land resources, which can be used, for example, to preserve biodiversity in our wildlife and sustain them into the future. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Phillips, for a great talk. We have already got quite a few questions. I'm going to read the questions for you guys. Let's see, the first one we have for Dr. Carolina Maciel. The question is there a public consultation or civil society consultation mechanism to WTO? How can NGOs and their supporters influence WTO, if at all? It's kind of a long question. Is it something single NGOs can participate in, or is it better to work in coalition to influence WTO? It's a long question.
Thank you for the question. That would deserve a whole new presentation about NGOs and WTO lobby. But glad with the question. So let me answer by going back to the main functions of the WTO, as each of them has different avenue for communication with the WTO. So remember that I said there is the administration of the existing chapters, agreements, trade disputes, and there is negotiation. So there isn't a formal civil society consultation for each of them, but there are avenues. So in the implementation and negotiation, we have the public forum, which is it's when the WTO opens the doors of its headquarters to workshops organized by NGOs. And we had in the past some of these events, and it was quite successful to conveying our message on how those existing treaties can be interpreted in a more animal welfare friendly way. So to allow the distinction between methods of production, so to allow the acceptance of import and export spends, for instance. Now, in terms of the dispute settlement, the NGOs can write what we call amicus curiae, which is a legal opinion, a formal legal opinion, and they can submit it to the so-called judge that are looking at the case. And that was been a huge importance. So again, we can speak directly with the adjudicators of a case. In terms of the influence, the influence of the NGOs, it's very important. Both the trade law and animal welfare are highly complex set of knowledge. So having NGOs to help governments to understand and implement is very important. And I want to highlight that yesterday, the World Federation for Animals held an event to celebrate the World Day for Animals, and we had the presence of Santiago Ills, which was the chair of the negotiating the agreement on the fisheries agreement, and he specifically said the importance of the NGOs coming together and in coalition. So answering one of the last questions, whether we should work in isolation or coalition, I definitely think we would need to work in coalition, because that conveys the message. If we as NGOs can come to a consensus on how best to move forward with trade measures related to animal protection, we can best convey this message to the governmental, since governments need to find a consensus among 164 countries in order to sign an agreement. And yesterday, the ambassador said the importance of NGO bringing and translating those knowledge and helping build this consensus towards the improvement. So that would be, once again, the answering now the question. So there is ways, there is no formal consultation, but there are ways in which NGO can speak directly with trade officials, and the influence are most welcomed.
Okay, great. Thank you. We got quite a few more questions coming in. I think we have, I don't know how much time left we have, maybe another 7 minutes, I figure. Now let's go to another question addressed to Daniel. This question is about who are the monitoring, who are monitoring and enforcing free trade agreements? What are the chances for NGO to join the monitoring process?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very, very important question indeed. I forgot to mention a bit of that in my presentation. Concerning the implementation of the trade agreement, so you have various parts. So all the sustainable development part, the TSD chapters, that in the EU we have what we call the DAG, the domestic advisory groups, where NGOs can actually sit there and monitor the implementation. So you don't only have NGOs, you also have the business, and you also have unions that sit there and they can monitor the implementation. At the moment, there are 12 DAGs monitoring 12 trade agreements. But the problem is that the scope, our remit is limited to TSD chapters. So we cannot really say how the implementation of the market access is going. We can only monitor, raise questions, share concerns, and it's an independent body. So we're completely free to have our discussions, to share from EU side and also from our partner side. So we have EU NGOs sitting on the one side, and we also have NGOs from the partner country also sitting, and we can discuss and we can share information and raise common concerns on that. The problem being that for now it's only limited to the TSD chapter, which I said is nice words, but most of the time is that it's nice words and we cannot do much about it.
Okay, great. Now we have a question for Professor Philip. I think Professor Philip can answer the question, right? And the question is also what I'm very interested regarding the Roberins index for animals. The question asks, can you discuss this more? Where does the scale begin and end, and where else has it been applied? Professor Phillips?
I think he experienced some technical problems and would not be able to be present for the Q&A, but we are taking note of that and we'll send him the question. And I think he'll be able to get back to the person who asked the question later. Thank you.
Okay. Now we do have another question for Daniel. All of the articles in the free trade agreement you shared are still in principle, not in actual practice. Do you have any recommendations for animal welfare advocates to ensure such enforcement in reality?
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, my main recommendation that we can include in a trade agreement would be to have a conditional liberalization of products. So to look into the production methods. What I said, for example, with New Zealand and Mercosur is indeed not enforced yet. It's just very theoretical. The agreements are not implemented, they have not been ratified. But that approach with New Zealand, we said, okay, all the beef that we're going to import from New Zealand has to be grass-fed, and all the eggs from Mercosur that are going to be imported, even if the quantity is very small, have to comply with the EU animal welfare standards. That approach, we need to expand it to all animal products, not just one species. So that would be the big recommendation I would have for any kind of trade agreement we have. It is to look how the products were produced, what were the animal welfare standards in that product, and if they were high enough, if they were good, then we can liberalize the product. Otherwise, we're just going to fuel unsustainable methods of production.
Very good. I do have a question for Dr. Maciel. So do we have any case related to the GATT exception Article 22 regarding farm animals? Have we had any dispute in farm animal trade related to the use of the exception provisions of WTO?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, you cited two cases regarding wild animals, right? Sea turtle and seals. Do we have any other case related to farm animals?
Thank you. Not yet, but I can see this coming up or being the next big trade dispute. And I definitely don't have what you call this magic ball to see the future, but I would bet that's the next big trade dispute. Nevertheless, even though these cases are related to wildlife, they are very important to give us clue on how to interpret. It's about the legal interpretation of the treaties, not necessarily the product itself. And for instance, another very helpful trade disputes is one about asbestos, which is a chemical component, or even another one for gasoline. So even though those trade disputes are not concerning animal-related products, they have been very helpful to interpret the WTO treaties in a way that it's helpful for us. One example is what is like products. Can we take into consideration when we assess the likeliness of two products? Can we take into consideration consumer perception? And yes, that was one of the outcome of the asbestos case.
Okay. I think we probably have time for one more question. Now, this would be for both of you. Improving policy is so incredibly important. It's also slow. How would you reassure those working for change in other ways that's still important and effective? So besides, policy, the policy aspect of the efforts, so how would you assure those working for change in other ways that is still important and effective?
Sorry, I'm not really sure if I understood the question, but it's that policy, it's a long road, and sometimes it takes time. Yes. That's true.
So we cannot wait for the policy, but we have to do the actions. So what are the ways that you guys think that how can you be sure that working for change in other ways would be also important? And I believe the question is also regarding lobbying activities, NGO campaigns, and so on and so forth.
I think our actions are towards either get a policy implemented or get a policy changed. And our actions don't necessarily need to be huge. Once again, going back to yesterday event where from the World Federation for Animals, where we heard directly from the former chair of the negotiation. Sometimes the help of the NGO can come with something as minor as helping the translation. And I don't say only on the language of English to local language, but on the technicalities. Some governments struggle. Some governments are very strong. They have a huge 50 plus people working on international relations. But if we take other governments that are from least developing countries, they have equal writing votes at the WTO. So they can stop the implementation of a policy at the WTO level. But if we bring the knowledge, and sometimes by bringing the knowledge, we lower the resistance, because everything that is unknown to us, we tend as a human to be afraid of. So NGOs working on the knowledge sharing and knowledge translation, that it's a huge help we can do for both the implementation of existing policies that sometimes we don't even know there's out there, and we don't need any change, we just need it to be implemented. And other times we need a change.
Yeah, and also, helping spread the information and put the pressures on policy makers and policy elites. So what about, what's your take, Daniel, on that question?
I mean, on that question, I would say, yeah, indeed, trade policy is a very slow motion. It's a very slow train. So, there's have to be patient that and have to continue working on that. NGOs is very important. But as a citizen, as a consumer, I think something very important, it is to be a bit more cautious on what we're actually consuming. In Europe, for example, for egg products, we have a labeling where you have like the 0, 1, 2, 3, and you can see what the egg comes from, what kind of range was it? Was in a cage, free range? You can see all this. And if you look into what you're actually consuming, we might actually change a little bit. The production in eggs in Europe has shifted a little bit towards more friendly animal welfare policies for chickens, for hens, because consumers want this change. So it is very important that we look into that. I would say, like, don't consume meat products, go vegan, go vegetarian. That actually might make a change.
Yes, there is an underlying assumption in, I would say, at least some developing countries, that more meat consumption, that's a modern way of life or modern lifestyle. And also, besides the cultural, religious, factors impacting meat consumption, meat product, there is also a political, economic aspect, right? A nationalistic aspect. Countries want to eat more meat so that they can be, economically powerful and physically, strong, to achieve certain, desirable political goals. So it's a very complicated matter. And I believe we have all the time we have, right, for this panel. Am I right? Yeah, I believe so. But anyway, thank you guys. Great talk. And so this question, deserve, continued, dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, especially to the speakers and the moderator, and to everybody who has come here today to listen to the wonderful session given by Dr. Carolina Maciel, Daniel, and Dr. Phillips. It's a shame that there was technical issues with Dr. Phillips, so he could not be present for the Q&A. But any questions you ask during the session will send to him, and then I think he'll be able to get back to you. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, bye-bye.